Hi, Tony Heller. Thanks for joining us here by Skype. I had the occasion of watching your "Doing the Right Thing." That's the title of a short video that you posted on December 14th, 2019, in which you describe the censorship that you've been subjected to by the large social media companies. So I wanted you to tell us about that. This is for the Ontario Civil Liberties Association. We're very concerned about this kind of thing. And maybe you could just give us an open-ended introduction, and then I'll have some follow-up questions.
Okay. Well, there's all kinds of censorship which people of my genre and speaking from my own personal experience face as being climate skeptics. I think probably the most egregious is actually not necessarily from social media, but it's more from large newspapers like the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, who have an openly stated policy that they will not allow voices to be make themselves heard who question various forms of climate alarmism. I spoke before I gave a presentation to the Washington State Senate a few years ago, and most of probably 80% of my presentation was just old newspaper clips from the New York Times. And then when the New York Times reported on it, it was basically a hit piece. They didn't accurately represent what I said. In fact, they had the entire topic of my presentation was wrong. And when I tried to correct it, I contacted them and tried to get them to correct it. They didn't. They never got back to me. One of my best friends is a big person in the newspaper industry, and she knew everyone at the New York Times contacted them. They still refused to contact me, make corrections, give me any sort of voice. They just all they were going to print was their misrepresentation of what I said. And the LA Times has similar policy, and I consider this to be just a gross violation of civil rights. The newspapers are supposed to be the defenders of free speech, and when they're actually doing the exact opposite, they're the worst violators of it. But getting back to the
But I take your point. I mean, it's almost like they're creating the content that they want to put out there,
yeah.
using you as a pretext and using you as a prop, basically.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
They don't make any attempt to accurately represent what I said. And the same thing with all the papers in Seattle. Not a single one of them said a single word about what I said in the presentation. It was all just their headlines were all climate denier speaks in Senate. And that was the only thing they said, and it was intended to be a hit piece. I would assume that the content of my presentation was fairly effective because they didn't make any attempt to contradict or question anything that I said. It was a personal attack and a hit
Yeah.
piece based on my overall, the belief about the topic. I'm a
Yeah.
heretic. Um,
No, but Tony, you have a large influence and following on social media,
right,
and that has recently been the place where they have censored you or have been
right,
limiting how much outreach you can have.
right.
Um,
Yeah, yeah. Twitter has shut down my account or suspended my account several times without any cause at all. Everyone who knows me knows that I'm a very mild mannered person. I get along with everyone. I was at a party the other day in Los Alamos, New Mexico, sitting next to the Los Alamos leading climate alarmist. I never talk about politics in person with people, and we got along great. We were talking about birds. Um, Nothing I said was worthy of suspension, rebuke, or anything like that, but they just come up with excuses to censor me. They do things like Twitter does things like they block all of my images for most people. They mark it as sensitive content. Almost all the images I post are like pictures of birds or scenery, old newspaper articles. Occasionally I'll post an image of a grisly image, which was a Spanish drawing of an Aztec sacrifice. And I do that in the context of climate stuff. But for the most part, 99.9% of the images that I post are just pictures of birds and
But
newspaper.
there is one time where they claimed that one of your images was sensitive, and it was actually a climate map of North America or the United
Right, right.
States.
Yeah,
What?
yeah,
Yeah,
the majority of people on Twitter, that's what they see when I post an image. It'll say this. They'll instead of them seeing the image, they'll see something about this may contain sensitive content, right? And exactly what you're describing.
right. It's kind of it's what's been called shadow banning in a sense. I
Right.
mean, it's they're not being upfront. They're using a pretext. They're triggered too easily to censor an image, maybe based on a complaint or some internal mechanism. I don't know. But
I,
yeah,
I I think it's more just based on the overall some of the other things I'm going to be discussing. I suspect that somebody is paying for this would be my guess. And I'll get into why I believe that later. Another thing they haven't done is they've never verified my account. I have almost 50,000 followers, and my account's not been verified. I don't think there's very many other people with 50,000 followers who don't have a verified account.
we're talking about Twitter now.
Right,
This blue chip verification.
right.
Do you have to apply for that? How does that work?
No, they do it automatically. And
Uh-huh.
like an example I made in that video is that Serena Williams' baby has been verified. And
Right.
I don't think that her baby is posting a lot of content personally.
Right. And nor would the baby be able to respond about her true identity or anything like that.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
so it's absurd. And then other things, so because of the fact that they don't verify my account, there's all kinds of imposters. There's people who make accounts pretending to be me. They actually say that they are me, and they post all kinds of, really nasty stuff, untrue things. And the intent is to confuse people because my account isn't verified. The people say, "Oh, I'm Tony Heller. I'm a horrible person," kind of thing.
Right. Yeah.
And so then people go and they do a Twitter search for me, and that's what they come to instead of coming
Now,
to.
when that kind of a false account gets created, there must be a mechanism to get it eliminated.
Yes, and I've complained, and Twitter doesn't do anything about it. There's never any action taken against them.
So there
So,
are presently such fake accounts?
oh yeah, yeah. There's numerous of them. Yeah, and a lot of times when I give talks, people say to me, why are you say people say to me, you gave an excellent presentation, but why are you so self-effacing on the internet? And I say, I'm not sure what you mean. And they say, well, I went web to your website or your Twitter account, and you said all these terrible things about yourself. So it's an effective technique of, people say, hey, you should check out this guy Tony Heller on Twitter or his blog, and people go and look and they say, well, this guy's horrible. Why would I want to see him? So it's an effective technique.
Yes.
And
And the
and
only way you could really defend yourself would be if you had a lot of money, you could do a defamation lawsuit against Twitter
right,
and say that they're defaming you, that they're publishing defamatory material about you, and within the common law, that would have some sway.
right,
But it's a horribly expensive thing. You'd have to have lawyers and lots of money.
right,
Uh, so if you don't have that, you have no defense, right?
right. And I have a belief that the person who's financing this does have a very large amount of money. So it'd be extremely difficult for me to do anything about it.
But
Um,
that belief of yours, um, would it be fair to characterize it as a conspiracy theory in the sense that, I mean, it's hard to get evidence about that. It would all be
right.
circumstantial evidence.
I wouldn't call it a conspiracy theory, but there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that one particular billionaire is doing a lot of dirty tricks like this. There's a widespread belief around the skeptic community based on various pieces of circumstantial evidence that he's involved in this. Um, and okay, so another example which I gave in that video was YouTube. If you go and do a Google search for YouTube Tony Heller, instead of the first things that come up, instead of being my videos, are some English politician named Mellon Baker, I think. And he has a very small number of subscribers on YouTube. Um, and when he posts a video, it doesn't have a lot of viewers. But what he does is he makes videos saying he's debunking what I'm saying. And so that's what comes up. So those are the top three things that come
Now,
up on
let me
YouTube.
be clear on that. That's when you do a search within YouTube
No,
or
no, on Google.
in
Yeah,
Google. So if you do a general Google search,
right. Yeah,
the
YouTube.
top hits
Yeah,
are people who are debunking you in quotations.
right, right,
Whereas here you are with a lot of followings on several social media platforms,
right,
you're talked about in the media, even if it is just to say nasty things or be critical of you. But the first things that come up, the first search results, are someone else who
right,
doesn't have this following and is being critical of you.
right.
So
Exactly.
how is this possible? This is a Google search.
Right. So so there's two possible things. One is that there's some sort of internal politics in Google which is making this happen, and the other possibility is that somebody's paying for it somehow for this to happen. Maybe it may be that someone is exploiting their commercial policies at Google. But it's definitely one of those. It's not something that's happened by any.
You're saying when you say paying for it, you mean that Google would be taking a bribe to do this.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily call it a bribe, but they do have, there's mechanisms, I believe, for, you know, paying to get your content raised up in Google.
Well, yes, but it's done by technical means.
Oh, right,
They have these algorithms where they search more for those sites that they want to promote, and they make that go for a while, and that influences how the Google algorithm measures things. I mean, I've heard of these technical ways of getting your content out there,
right.
and that would be just hiring experts to do that. Is that the kind of thing you have in mind?
Well, I've never really researched it, but it's
Hmm.
obviously there's obviously something,
Yes.
going wrong, and it's not by accident. If it was just a fair algorithm, my videos, I've had 15 million views for my videos. I have a very wide reach. They would definitely appear at the top, not this Malin Baker guy who has a very small reach. But by doing this, and people go and search for me, instead of seeing my videos, they see somebody who says he's debunking me. And this is obviously by design. Somebody has engineered this one way or another.
Well, that is massively important because Google is probably the way that we research people and their
Right,
influence and their ideas.
right,
So it's a massive uh, deviation of how the ordinary person sees the world and sees other people.
right. And then that was the reason I named that video "Doing the Right Thing" because Google's motto used to be "Doing the Right Thing," and
Hmm.
obviously they're not. That's
Right,
not what's
right,
going on. And
right.
and with other stuff with Google, there's quite a few websites out there doing the same thing as I mentioned with the Twitter account. They pretend to be me and just post all sorts of defamatory content. And it's gotten better recently, but at one time, those were the top things that came up if you did a Google search for Tony Heller. And these have had a huge impact on me. I've lost jobs over it. I've lost new contracts over it. There was a company in California a few months ago who was all excited about hiring me, and I talked to everyone in the company, and they had a big group call with everyone in the company, and then somebody did a Google search, and that was the end of it. And so
I mean, even if they knew it was a fake account, just the fact that this is what people are seeing.
Right,
Right?
exactly.
The
Yeah,
the yeah.
yeah. So it's whoever's paying for this again, for it is obviously it's a technique intended to to limit me, to frighten me, to try to deter me away from doing what I'm doing. It's a pretty clear attack on my right to free speech.
Yeah.
There,
Now, I have personally noticed many cases where Facebook, we haven't talked about Facebook yet, but Facebook will prevent someone from reposting things or
right,
sharing things in a very overt way. They'll say, you're sharing too much.
right,
But the people who are complaining about this are always sharing too much on issues that are considered not acceptable, or that the establishment doesn't want out there.
right,
So there's interference with the sharing part of the algorithms.
right.
And that's very severe at Facebook. Have you noticed that in your affairs?
No, I haven't seen too much of that. I do have a number of other issues with Facebook, but it's not specifically with Facebook itself. Um, it's specific people on Facebook who like run climate forums who engage in censorship. So I can't really blame that on Facebook itself.
Right, right, right.
The other thing I was going to say about YouTube is that on my videos, they always typically at the bottom of my video they'll put a little propaganda banner saying about global warming and with some blurb from Wikipedia, which goes on to my videos all the time, and that seems to me to be that's very abusive. They don't have the right to deface people's content with their beliefs. That seems to me another gross violation of free speech.
Yes, yes, and they do that now with media sources as well. They'll point out that a media source from Canada, for example, the CBC in Canada, is funded by the Canadian government,
Okay.
whereas the corporate media are clearly have large financial interests behind them, but there's
Right.
no
Oh,
message to that effect for the
okay.
corporate media. Yeah. So no, I understand. Well, that pretty much explains
Yeah.
the nature of the censorship against you. But let me put it another question to you. How would you answer if someone said, "Well, it's not censorship because these corporations are protecting the public and even protecting the planet by not allowing your material, which is dangerous material." How would you respond to that?
Well, let me give an example. I'm a Jew, all right, and in the 1930s, there was this widespread belief in Germany, spread by politicians, that Jews were a threat to the country, and that they needed to be sent, that their voice was not allowed to be heard. They were a danger, and if we allowed their voices to be heard, they would do bad things to the country. So when newspapers make that decision that to engage in that sort of activity, they become extremely dangerous. They've got a certain belief that somebody's dangerous. And you see this over and over again. This group of people is dangerous. They had the same sort of thing against blacks in the United States for a long time. Black people are, their culture is dangerous. It's bad for the country. So we don't get newspapers wouldn't give black people a voice. So we've seen this pattern over and over again of prejudice and bigotry and newspapers making subjective judgments about who are good people, who are bad people. And every time they've done this, it's led to really bad things happening.
But I'm continuing with the devil's advocacy thing here.
Right,
You
right,
could argue that those other censorships from the past were not science-based, whereas this censorship is science-based. You've got the entire, supposedly the entire scientific establishment that's saying that, we're all going to die, and we can't have people saying that that isn't so, because then we won't be responding as we should to this emergency. They're calling it an emergency.
right. Well, you know, you could say the same thing about Germany in the 1930s. You had a large group of scientists pushing eugenics. They, they, it was what they did in Germany and in the Soviet Union with Lysenko. They also called it science-based. So this is nothing new. It's the same and the same thing with blacks, right? In the United States, there were scientists said that white people were superior. And so it's always science-based. All of these examples I gave were, science-based, they claimed. And the statistics you always hear about, 97% of scientists believe this. There's no basis to that. These are based on fake studies. These are political statements. There's never been any sort of survey of scientists. There's many leading scientists who would fall on my side. Freeman Dyson is considered to be the top living physicist in the world. He's a climate skeptic. Harrison Schmitt, the only scientist who've ever walked on the moon, is a very famous climate skeptic. And
But
so,
the censorship argument, the anti-censorship argument, doesn't have to use that there are scientists. Doesn't have to go where you're
right,
going now. But I understand your response to my question because that's
right,
where I'm taking you. But what would be your solution to this censorship problem I mean, it's not just in climate science. It's in so many things now. How
right.
would you solve it?
Well, isn't the okay, so the excuse that's oftenly used for not giving me a voice, like in newspapers, is that it would legitimize me, right? And the only way they're going to legitimize me is if my point is effective and credible. So what I always say is I have an open, standing offer to every well-known climate scientist in the world for debate. He says, let's have a debate. Let's have a public debate. The way you delegitimize me is by defeating me in that debate. Let's get it out in the air. If you say that my ideas are wrong and that they're very easy to debunk, well, let's do it. Let's have the debate. You can debunk me, prove me wrong, and that's how you delegitimize me. The only way they're going to legitimize me is if they lose the debate, in which case they're wrong. So
Yes.
that's
The
how,
free market of ideas. That's
right,
what you're talking about, that notion
right.
of the free market of ideas.
And that's the whole idea behind free speech is you allow everybody to present their ideas and whichever one is the best one wins. And
Yes.
that's what they're afraid. That's why they censor because they're afraid that my idea will win the debate,
Yes.
right? So it's a terrible weakness on their part. It's the same thing which went on in the Soviet Union. And in some ways it benefits me because like Solzhenitsyn became very interesting because just precisely because he was censored and he ended up, winning the Nobel Prize or Pulitzer Prize, whatever it was, over it. So because of the fact that I'm heavily censored and people know about it, it attracts people to me. So what is it? Why don't they want our hands in this cookie jar? There's something good inside there. So it's a two-edged sword for them. It makes them look very bad, and it creates interest for me. But I would
Well,
definitely, yes, sir.
yeah, our position at the Ontario Civil Liberties Association is that censorship is harmful to society.
Right,
And that is clearly established with many historical examples.
right,
And so a society that allows censorship rules and that promotes them and develops them is doing harm to itself.
right,
It can't repair itself by hearing the ideas it needs to hear and so on.
right.
Yeah.
And every great advancement mankind's ever made has been from people who bucked the consensus.
Hmm.
Anyway, my undergraduate degree is in geology, and my professor at Arizona State University, Bob Dietz, he was the guy who finally broke the camel's back about resistance to the idea of continental drift. Because the scientific community resisted the idea of continental drift for 50 or 60 years, even though the evidence was overwhelming that continental drift was real. You had this climate orthodoxy that continental drift couldn't exist because nobody could explain how the mechanism behind it. Um, so this is a long-standing problem in sciences, and it's a difficult problem. And by the way, I wanted to mention too that I used to work in Ontario. I used to work in
Oh,
Hamilton, so I have some connections to Ontario
oh,
myself.
interesting,
Yeah,
interesting. Wow, it is the Ontario Civil Liberties Association. That's an interesting
yeah.
connection. Yeah,
Right.
it's been a great pleasure interviewing you about this censorship that you're being subjected to. I want to thank you very much for the time that you made for us.
Okay, well, thanks. It was good talking to you, and I really appreciate your interest because, the American Civil Liberties Union has become extremely political, and they seem to be far more concerned in pushing left-wing causes than in actually protecting civil liberties across the spectrum. So I was really impressed when you contacted me to see that Ontario is more concerned about their core mission than what's going on in this country. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Tony Heller.
Okay, thank you,
Great.
Dennis. Okay.
Bye.